Welcome back, thespians. Today we are going to start our journey into looking at English Renaissance theater. Most of you guys have a little bit of background knowledge on the English Renaissance from your English classes. So I want you to think about, what do you know about this time period? Hopefully there's something that you want to know a little more about, and by the end you should be able to talk about what you have learned from this unit. What you may know already is that Shakespeare is from this time period, because you usually cover Shakespeare in your English classes. Now, you don't have to write this down, but I want you to think for a minute. If you were king or queen, what policies would you mandate under your rule? And how do you think that would change society as a whole? If we look at the history of theater, we understand that from the very beginning, theater is dictated by who is in charge. So with the Greeks, the fact that they are a polytheistic religion with multiple gods, the gods influence the fact that there is theater to begin with, being that most of them came out of festivals for the gods. Same thing with early Roman theater, and then when it turned secular, because the rulers wanted that kind of violent, bloody animal fights and chariot races. That was enveloped by the leaders. And then when the Catholic Church came into play, that's when they shut it all down and got rid of everything, which led us to the Dark Ages, which brought us back to the church. The church being the huge factor in what was ruling everything at the time. And then when the Catholic Church began to break off into different Protestant religions, then you start to see different positions on whether or not religion, theater would be accepted or not. And that's what we're going to kind of look at today. So, theater history, English Renaissance. So, to kind of get a sense of what is going on as we come out of the Middle Ages, we know that in Italy, they're starting the Italian Renaissance, and it works its way over to England. So there are three periods that happen. The English Renaissance generally is known to have lasted for 165 years, and during that time period, you have the Elizabethan period, the Jacobean, and the Caroline period, and they are named after the rulers of that time. So the Elizabethan period is during Queen Elizabeth, Jacobean is during King James, and the Caroline is during Charles. But we got to go back a little bit further to King Henry. So around 1485, King Henry VII, he was in charge when we start to see the Renaissance beginning as we come out of the Middle Ages. Then we get to Henry VIII, and you may remember this name from the old song, I'm Henry VIII, I am, Henry VIII, I am, I am. He got married to the widow next door. She's been married 7 times before, and like, it's that old song. Most people don't know that. But it was one of those little childhood chants. Anyway, King Henry is the first king to break from the Catholic Church and establish the Church of England. He did this because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and the story of his wives is a whole other story. Anyway, this started the Protestant Reformation in England. And there was a struggle back and forth between Henry and his Church of England and other monarch leaders who come in after him who want to bring the Catholic Church back. So, for example, after his reign, Edward the Sixth and Bloody Mary, they reinstate the Catholicism until Edward's death. He didn't stick around for very long, but she's called Bloody Mary because they beheaded a bunch of people who would not convert back. But then Queen Elizabeth comes. She's actually the daughter of Henry, And when she comes back in, she reinstates the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And with this, as you remember in our earlier notes from the Middle Ages, she kind of bans religious theater, uh, almost, I think, out of spite for the Catholic Church. But Queen Elizabeth is actually one of the strongest proponents and advocates for secular theater. And it is because of her that we see the public theaters and Shakespeare really grow during her reign. And she reigned for quite a long time, as you can see. After her was James the First. He was also known as the Scottish King, and Shakespeare was known to have written Macbeth for him because James had this fascination with the supernatural. So it was a play set in Scotland with all this myth around him. It had witches, it had ghosts, it had a whole bunch of stuff. And then we end it with Charles. So Charles the First comes in, but you can see that this period abruptly ends in 1649. And it abruptly ends because Charles the First is beheaded. The Puritans come in and they overthrow the monarchy. And when they do that, because they are religious based, they shut down theater for being immoral. And we'll look at those notes towards the end. So there's Queen Elizabeth. So hopefully this has you thinking about how the reigning monarch can influence the direction of theater. Usually I break this down a little more, but we're going to move swiftly through it. So maybe a question for discussion is, why do you think people still read and perform Elizabethan drama today? I hope you have an answer for that. Maybe we'll discuss that on Friday. So early drama. We had these little pieces of drama called interludes, and they existed under Henry VII and Henry VIII. And they were brief dramatic entertainments written and staged by professionals that were presented at court or in the homes of nobility. And at court means that it's in the presence of um, royalty. You also have school drama. So remember, universities had popped up. There was this increased uh, focus on human beings and knowledge and studying art. And these school dramas were written and presented at universities and schools. They weren't really presented for the public, but more for educational study. And those existed from around the 1500s to 1580. Elizabethan drama. So this expanded on Seneca's revenge-obsessed characters and the use of supernatural and violence. So remember Seneca from the Roman time period? Here his influence is really taking off. They imitated the comic plots and the techniques of Plautus and Terence. Remember Plautus, our master of comedy, and Terence, our rewriter of Greek works? So here you have these three playwrights from the Roman era really influencing what's being done during the English Renaissance. They also use parallel plots and subplots, and we get the use of soliloquies. Usually, an acting company during this time would have approximately 25 men. You would have kind of like a tier of people similar to what's today, but still very different. So you would have these shareholders or these investors. They were the money. They owned the companies. They were the rich. They had hirelings, and the hirelings were who they hired. They would hire directors, they would hire the writers, and they would hire the actors. And then you had these apprentices, and these were pretty much free labor, young men who were looking to try to eventually get hired as as an actor or writer, or apprentices could also apprentice under shareholders. Acting was probably still a little unrealistic at this time. Remember, we had these very declamatory speeches, to be or not to be. Um, it wasn't as natural sounding as what we see on stage today. And there were still no females in this section of Europe. So the scenery and the costumes, the scenery did not represent a specific locale. So, um, when we look at our costuming today, there's specific costumes for specific areas of the world or the time period. And for here, it didn't exist. They just wore what English Renaissance men wore every day and English Renaissance women wore every day. And by that, I mean that the men dressed as the women parts. You had spoken decor. So the stages were very plain. You wouldn't have any scenery really. The actors would actually describe the setting. So that's why the language in Shakespeare and other English Renaissance writers is so important. For example, in the beginning of Macbeth, um, I'm sorry, in the beginning of Hamlet, there's two soldiers that are standing and guard on the castle wall. And you see these two actors, and there really isn't much said around them, but they're sitting there shivering and they're talking about how cold it is. And by their actions and talking about, it being winter and that was that the clock that struck 12, by hearing it in what they're talking about, you then know that it's winter, it's cold, and it's about midnight. And again, costumes were in contemporary English fashion. So, in addition to understanding the progression of theater, we can also look at the progression of the theater building from Greek to the Renaissance. And in the Italian Renaissance that we looked at, we saw how important the Italians were to creating the theater that we have today. But the theaters were a little bit different in England. They had two types of theaters. They had a public theater and a private theater. And when we think of public, we think open to everybody. And private, we think, only a few people can get in. It's kind of like that. But actually, the public and the private refer more to where the buildings were located and how they were built. So a public theater was actually located outside of London. So you had the city of London, and then across the Thames River was the outskirts, and that's where you would find a lot of the public theaters. They were open air, meaning they did not have a full roof. So if you look at the top here, that's actually all open in there. There's these slanted thatches, but there's no roof. They usually had a circular um, shape, or maybe they were a shape of an octagon or a square. The audience seating, there was usually three tiers. So you had your pit, your boxes, and your gallery. There was the Lord Room, and that was reserved for the wealthy. And the yard. The yard is where the groundlings or the lower class would stand. And during these productions, food would be sold throughout the performances. So, you would have these wenches selling beer and fruit um, during the show. The stage was like a modern day thrust stage. And if we haven't talked about the styles of stage, you have the proscenium, like during the Italian Renaissance, and what we have in our pack today, where the stage area is separated by the proscenium arch, and then you have the audience on the other side. A thrust stage is best compared to a catwalk, I guess, for a fashion show where the stage juts out and you have the audience on three sides of the action. And then you have an arena stage where the action happens in the middle and there's seating all around it, kind of like stadium seating. So the stages were more like a modern day thrust. They had a tiring house, kind of like the Greek skene. They had a musician's gallery, and then painted above the painted above the stage itself, there would kind of be like a little roof, and if you looked up, it was usually painted very elaborately, um, with sky and angels or cherubs, and those were called the heavens. And a flag would be mounted outside if a performance was going on. So if we're looking at the city of London, so here you have London here, and then this is the Thames River. And this is where all of your, oh, if that would go away. There we go. If that goes away, down at the bottom of the screen, you can see the Globe Theater, which sometimes is called Shakespeare's Globe, the Rose, the Hope, the Swan. Those were the names of the public theaters. If you look up in, whoops, ooh, if you look at the city section, you would see little theaters called the Blackfriars, and this is the most famous private theater. So, public theaters over here, private theaters within the walls of the city. So, here's an example of what the globe would look like from the inside. What an amazing experience to be able to watch the show from this view. The original globe was destroyed by fire in 1613, and they immediately rebuilt it, but it closed in 1644 under the Puritans. Remember, I said when Charles got beheaded, the Puritans came in? That's when all the theaters shut down. Um, it was rebuilt and opened in 1997. And um, the replica of it is, they tried to model it as closely to the original as possible, but it is not in the same location as the original globe. In fact, if you go to London, you can go to the spot where the original globe was, and they have a plaque, uh, but the replica globe is down the street. And if you're looking at this, you can see these are your three different levels of seating, and your richest would be higher up. And you would think, oh, that's the worst kind of view, but you know, that's the way it was. Down bottom, this is the yard. So it's literally just dirt and uh, literally just dirt and hay down here. And these members would have to stand, the groundlings would stand for the entire performance. Sometimes they would lean up against the stage and get spat on by the actors who were projecting so well. And, um, you know, I had the opportunity to study abroad when I was in college in 2001, and it is really such a better experience to be standing here and seeing the action from this view. And sometimes the actors would come running through the groups of people. So here you also have your doors, like the Greek skene. You have these columns, and then above here, like I said, was the heavens. But all of this is open. So if it rained, it rained. And here is a great drawing of the original globe, old drawings. Then we have our private theaters. So your private theaters were indoors. As you can see, they are completely covered, safe from the rain. These were more expensive. Like you could go into a private theater and just pretty much pay pennies um, to see a show. The private theaters were a little more expensive. And so because they were less attended by the poor. So I guess, it excludes the poor people, makes it a little more, private, so to speak. But you can see that they had the same tiered seating. However, they had bench seating in the front. And the pricing was similar to today's. So for the better seats, you would pay more money and less money for the less desirable seats. And because they were in the city, they were much smaller. And your famous example of this is the Blackfriars. So hopefully you were able to learn something about the English Renaissance that you didn't know before. And if you got to watch a show in the theater, where would you want to sit? I know where I would. Um, Three great playwrights that came out of this time period are Christopher Marlowe. Isn't he a sweetie pie? Look at that baby face. Christopher Marlowe, who is known for writing some of the greatest plays of this period. He is lesser known. However, he was more famous during his time period than Shakespeare was. Um, Marlowe had an untimely death. There's really great stories and history about him, but there's a lot of rumors too that Shakespeare didn't exist, that it was really a second pen name for Christopher Marlowe. Others say that Shakespeare stole the work of Marlowe. Others, yeah, there's so many different rumors. And then towards the end of the era, um, more towards the Jacobean period, we have Ben Jonson. So I don't know that I'm going to go through. Oh, I don't have all my notes for them. We don't really need to go through each of the playwrights individually. Hopefully, you learned a little something about the English Renaissance and this time period.